we have a pretty good idea where the Bucks are going to finish. I think so. So we'll examine that and some of your questions as well, as we are live here on this Easter Sunday, and some comments that came in on social media last night as well. Questions you guys had about this Bucks team as we start to head into the postseason. Camille and I will get to all of that after this on today's Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia here with you. You can also hear me on the Bucks Radio Network, joined by Camille Davis, and you can find her work obviously on Locked On each and every day on the Technical Foul podcast as well. Pack-A-Day podcast with Packers season. What, Camille? We're going to find out the schedule in a couple of weeks already for the Packers. Football never ends. But that's where you can find our work outside of this. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. Free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and viewable on YouTube as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. So, Camille, we go back to last night, and the Bucks, I had talked about this with a few other people as it was happening, and it was one of those things where you put the comment out there and think, like, people going to overreact to this. I thought it was a big win, an impressive win, a very good win. They were 0-5 in games without Damian Lillard prior to last night, and there's a number of reasons why I thought this was a pretty good win for the Bucks. Winning without Damian Lillard, the way they came together throughout the game, and the way they held off some of those Hawks charges, especially once they made it a 2-possession game in the fourth quarter. Some individual performances that stood out that I do want to get to in a moment. The way that they found their offense, I also want to dissect and get to in a moment. But look, as much as we joke about it, these are the games the Bucks have struggled in, not just the Damian Lillard-less games, but against those teams that are kind of in the mid to lower tier of the league, and especially against teams that are without their leading scorer and a handful of their best players.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the context matters as to why one would say this was a big win for the Bucks. You pair the fact that they are coming in on a 2-game losing streak, lost at home against the Lakers, lost on the road against the Pelicans, and then you see, like, there's no Dame. The Bucks were 0-5 without Dame prior to this game last night against the Hawks. You look at just everything that's been going on. We've been talking about the last few games with Chris Middleton coming back from injury, how the shot wasn't falling for him. So you see him get going. We've talked about Pat Bev playing through injury, and now he is tasked with starting while he's playing with a torn ligament in his wrist that will require surgery in the offseason. And, like, you're like, hey, Pat, like, we need you to run the show. And he goes in and he puts together a really, really solid performance for Pat Bev. And it's against a Hawks team that was on a homestand. This was the 5th game of their 5-game homestand. They had won their previous 4, including 2 big wins over the Celtics. One went to overtime. We saw DeJounte Murray go for 44 on 44 shots. Like, we haven't seen a player put up 44 shots, that many shots, since Russell Westbrook and Kobe Bryant did so. Like, those are the only 2 players.
And ironically enough, came in a game played against Jason Tatum.
Right. So it's like, you understand, like, this is a team that was feeling pretty good about themselves coming into this game at home. Meanwhile, the Bucks were, 2-game losing streak, and narrative start once losses stack, especially as you're leading into the playoffs. The Bucks only had 9 games left at that point. So you don't want to be like, hey, it's a 3-game losing streak here as we're heading into the playoffs. So I'd agree. It's a much needed win for sure. A win for a Bucks team that, as we've seen throughout the season so far, haven't necessarily been able to get those wins without Dame. So seeing this team come together offensively, because that's really been the thing over the last few games where they just kind of stalled offensively, and seeing them find a way to get the ball in the hoop, move the ball around, and be productive on that end of the floor while maintaining a good defense. I definitely say this is a big win for the Bucks.
So I had talked about this last night on my post-game show too, in that, look, if you are, how would we put it, Camille, a skeptic, a Doc Rivers skeptic coming into the season here, or into the playoffs, I should say, I certainly get that. And there's nothing that you or me or anybody is going to say or point to during the regular season that is going to move you off of that opinion. It's got to be, well, I got to see it in the playoffs. But I do think, and I think we saw small pieces of this last night. I do think one of the areas where you would kind of circle and say, here's where I do have encouragement for this team under Doc Rivers in the postseason is the way they can and should, and we think will, attack matchups. It's not to say you have to do things one way or another, but I do think it was frustrating a lot of times for Bucks fans to see some clear matchups they did not take advantage of in the past 5 years. And with Doc Rivers, we've seen a little more of that. I'm not going to say the Bucks have become kings of exploiting mismatches. You've seen it increase a little bit, but hearing some of the things that Doc Rivers has had to say to me is what's the most encouraging part. It is not just after last night. It's been a constant refrain from Doc Rivers of we got to be the bigger team, more physical team, right? We're not going to win track meets. We got to be that tougher team, and we will do that by using our size. And I think when you think about that, you would point to obviously Giannis, you would point to Brook Lopez, and then Bobby Portis. And Doc has said several times, it's a two-way street. Like, we have to look for Brook Lopez when he's in the post, but Brook has to do a better job too of calling for the ball. Last night, I think you kind of saw, not necessarily all, but everything that Doc was pointing to, that started to really come together. When you look at their shot profile and where this was coming from, Noah Neka-Okongwu, it was a smaller Hawks team with basically just Clint Capella and out there Bruno Fernando as well, and Giannis has tortured him in the past. But you saw last night, Brook Lopez only took 3 shots. Only 1 was a three-pointer. Bobby Portis, 10 shots, only 2 were three-pointers. The Bucks shot 70% on their twos. They did not have a great three-point shooting night, but I think that's the other credit is not to pour salt in the wounds and pick over a fresh scab here, but we've seen locally recently, and we've seen it in the NBA in the playoffs as well, what happens when the three isn't falling and you keep going back to the well. Bucks only took 28 threes last night in that game against the Hawks. They did not shoot it well, and they kind of recognized not that you abandon the three because you still have to take open looks, but hey, in the meantime, why don't we just start to feast here?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, let me just be completely honest before I even respond to that point. You mentioned how there are people who aren't sold on Doc Rivers at this point, and there won't be until the playoffs start. I've said it before, but if you would have told me after the Bucks fired Mike Budenholzer that the head coach that will be leading the Bucks into the playoffs the following season will be Doc Rivers, I would have been like, we have Doc Rivers at home. Why are we doing this? What do you mean we went from Bud to Doc? But of course, with how this season went with Adrian Griffin at the helm for a period, and you saw what this team was missing, seeing Doc come in and get that low-hanging fruit like we've talked about and kind of just set this team up for success. It's what they needed. So to that point about perspectives on Doc Rivers, like I was somebody who wasn't necessarily thrilled initially about the hire, and I wouldn't have been after Mike Budenholzer was fired immediately thereafter, but seeing what he's been able to do with this team and how he communicates and how he's able to stress his point and what he wants to be done and seeing the players execute it, to your point, like it's been really, really good to see. And looking at the Bucks trying to take advantage of mismatches, Doc has been mentioning that for weeks now, saying we are a bigger team. We are not fast. We are not young. We are not that athletic. So that's not going to be the way that we can beat teams. We cannot get into track meets. We have to get it out the mud. We have to play through our size. And although Brook didn't have that many shot attempts, he did get 6 attempts at the free throw line. Yeah. And we have talked a lot about how coming out of All-Star break, the whistle's a bit different for the refs. Even seeing Giannis get to the line 16 times last night, I believe that's the most that he's had since coming back from the injury for sure. So seeing that they were able to use their size, not only just to say like we're getting looks, but to get to the free throw line, an area where this team hasn't been able to get as many looks, that's a big benefit as well. And I did see a Doc Rivers quote that I just want to read. So if you see me looking down, I'm looking at my phone for those on YouTube. Doc said, quote, to continue it and keep looking forward and don't get tired of throwing the ball to the post. I bet we said that 100 times tonight. Okay, we got a big guy sitting in the middle of the paint, throw it to him. And if they trap, throw it back out and let's get a 3. I think guys don't understand in and out basketball doesn't have to be with a drive. It can be with a post to out. And I thought we did that more tonight, end quote. So again, you got to take advantage of mismatches. And with this Bucks team having 2 7-footers in Brook and Giannis, and having a 6'10" Bobby Portis, like a lot of nights, they are going to have that size advantage. So to see this team getting used to getting the ball into the post, I mean, we made jokes last season about how there was nobody on the team who could even throw an entry pass into the post outside of Joe Ingles and Chris Middleton. So seeing them find different ways to activate getting looks around the rim outside of just post-ups, but looking for a guy running down the middle of the court, having their guys sealed off and just getting the pass to them. And if they don't have the shot, trusting that they're going to get the ball back out. So it's been really good to see that and encouraging to see that they're not shying away from playing through their size.
Yeah, and a couple of points to kind of tie into all of that I do want to get to, and some of the comments that have kind of addressed offensively what we've seen from this team, what Bucks fans want to see more of. And the big point that's coming up a lot, especially in the comments, but is we're starting to get to that point with 2 weeks left in the regular season now. Maybe not so much where the Bucks going to finish, because I've said all along it's going to be one of two places. Not all along. I've said for the last few weeks it's going to be one of two places. It does seem now like it's barring the Bucks going 0-3 into that matchup with the New York Knicks on 1 week from today, Sunday. It does seem like I'm not ready to call it yet, but I'm pretty confident they're going to be the 2 seed. So more importantly, what is that going to mean for a first round matchup? We'll get into all of that as well coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. This episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Prize Picks. It is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. It's the easiest and most exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sport and players. You just pick more or less than on 2 or more player stats and watch the winnings roll in. March is officially over, but the biggest moments in college basketball tip off in April. Be a part of the action on Prize Picks for both men's and women's college basketball. Get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during the NBA basketball's postseason. And you can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 with basketball, hockey, and college basketball entries today on Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. And it's that time of years. We have college basketball, professional basketball heading towards the playoffs, hockey heading towards the playoffs, Major League Baseball just started as well. So this is the best time to get in on that action with Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That code again is LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA. Use the code and get a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. You watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? You have to turn down the volume with all of that shouting? Well, make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, all streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And just before we get back to the Bucks discourse, Camille, the sidetrack, there is so much going on, and that's where Locked On Sports Today comes in handy, even brushing up on what in the world is going on with the Minnesota Timberwolves sale. So getting the local expertise on that is where Locked On Sports Today and the entire Locked On Podcast Network comes in handy. So we mentioned some of the things offensively. The other thing that I've really become, I suppose encouraged would be the word, but it's been noticeable to me for the last couple of weeks. I'm not to say it's been consistent. We've seen moments where it's deviated, and that's seemingly been in losses or late in the game against the Lakers. But when we talk about this offense and how Doc Rivers has been adamant, we've got to exploit mismatches. We've got to find those and take advantage. And again, as we talked about earlier in the season, that was one of the strengths of Trevor Gleason when you brought him on staff. It seems like, and I've seen the comment a bit in the comment section, ball movement That has clearly been there. The Bucks, I think, have been moving the ball quite a bit more since the All-Star break, but it's not just that. It's been player movement and rerouting after the initial pass. And, just think about the number of times that we've kind of grown accustomed to seeing the Bucks offense of the last 5 years with the whole let it fly and play random moniker that fans may not have loved. But you think about the amount of times you'll see an action set up and okay, I know how this is going to end. I think we've shifted a little bit away from that, where you've seen more of an increase in emphasis on players passing up good shots or their comfort shots for better shots. And I think it's specifically not to call out names or say what they were doing before was hurting the team, but I think specifically when you look at Giannis, when you look at Bobby Portis and Brook Lopez, again, those bigs, we've seen a number of times where you start to get into the action that you want, and maybe the look isn't totally there. In the past, that's a shot that is still going up. It has not to the same volume. So I think that message is starting to get through from Doc Rivers too. Of look, I'm not saying don't take that shot. Take it when you have the look that you want. You don't have it on that initial action. Set it up again. Kick it back out to the perimeter, move the ball around. We'll get it back to you. And then you can find that. And I think that's what's more encouraging than anything else moving into the playoffs. And when we talk about stagnation in the offense and how important the half court is, I think we've seen some very significant strides. Damian Lillard's a big piece of that. But as a team, I think we've seen some pretty clear strides in the half court.
I'd have to agree with that because you think about in the playoffs, right? And how the Bucks used to play offense under Mike Budenholzer, where it was a lot more stagnant. Like guys are in their spots and whoever has the ball, maybe they're in the action with one other guy. And then you might see something come very late. But it was a lot more stagnation where, as you mentioned, the off-ball movement, guys were in their spot because they knew where they were supposed to be in that 5-out spread offense. But now with Doc, I love that you pointed out the fact that they will just run it again. Like, okay, this didn't work. Run it again. Run it again. Keep trying to find a way to stretch that defense until they're finally in a position where it's not advantageous for them, but you have the shot that you're looking for. So I do love to see that. And as you mentioned, the ball movement piece has been talked about a lot. And I think with this team, given the talent that they have, with Giannis, with Dame, and even with Chris, those three in particular, where it's like sometimes when we talk about the ball, it gets stuck. It's because these guys are leaning on their own talent. It's like, hey, I know I can get this shot. And it's not necessarily a bad shot sometimes, but is it the best shot on the court? There are going to be times where you just got to continue to feed the hot hand. And we saw that when Giannis went for 20 straight, was against the Pelicans, where it's just like, okay, just keep getting the ball to Giannis as he is just completely cooking this defense. Just feed the hot hand until that defense reacts in a way where you need to change your actions out of it. So there is this balance that I think this team needs to find with understanding at times where, like, at times, yeah, let's continue to ride the hot hand. Let's continue to get the ball in the hand of Giannis or Dame and let them continue to cook. But when that action is no longer working or the defense has adjusted, now we need to get back into moving the ball around and making sure we can get the best shot available. So it's a delicate balance of like, okay, are we passing too much? Are we not passing enough? And you just really have to go based on what the defense is giving you and try to dictate your game that way. So to your point about just seeing better off-ball movement, I mean, that's part of the reason why I feel like Doc loves Pat Connaughton so much. He has applauded the way that Pat Connaughton can move off ball and how much that opens things up for other guys on the court. Even if the ball's not going to Pat, maybe his cut opens up the three, or maybe he's running around the perimeter. Now that opens up a cut for somebody else. So Doc is somebody who definitely loves that off-ball movement. And again, I think that's the reason why Pat Connaughton in particular is somebody who has gotten his minutes pretty consistent under Doc. And we heard Doc come in and saying, like, we need Pat Connaughton to get his confidence back up. And we've seen how Pat Connaughton has been playing under Doc Rivers. And I think it's been a real beneficial thing for the rest of the team. Because as mentioned, off-ball movement isn't necessarily just for yourself. It's to clear up things for the people around you as well on your team.
Yeah, and look, if you just look at the raw numbers in assists per game, it's pretty flat pre All-Star versus post All-Star for the Bucks. I think it's actually decreased slightly, but assist rate. In other words, the percentage of field goals that were assisted has gone up by about 3%. since the All-Star break. And that matches the eye test, where it just seems like they've had more of these games where you look up, especially recently, up until that 2-game skid, they had some very, very high assist numbers in those games, when all of a sudden 30 was becoming the norm. It seemed like, I think they had a stretch of 3 out of 5 games or 3 out of 6 games where they had 30 plus assists, highlighted by that 37 assist game in the loss to the Lakers. So it's definitely been more noticeable that I think this team is getting more comfortable in what they're asking for in terms of their offense and what they're looking for under Doc Rivers. And the assist numbers are the biggest thing to point to there. I think one other thing to point out too is I've seen a few people say, man, Dame's got to push the pace. And we've had somebody bring it up in the comments here as well, that Damian Lillard, he's got to play at a faster pace. We got to get the ball moving and attack with Giannis in transition. And look, there is some merit to that you'd love Giannis in transition more and more, since he is I think the best transition player in the league. But it's just not Dame's pace. And Doc has talked about this too. When we've talked about the unfair comparison that Damian Lillard was always going to face, that Drew Holiday was a plug-and-play player, Damian Lillard not so much. I think a lot of times when you think about scoring and you think about smaller guards, you assume, well, they play fast. They play at a quick pace. That's not Dame, and it never has been. He plays at his own pace. When you hear Doc and other coaches talk about Chris Middleton and that you can't speed him up, plays at his own pace. Dame is the same way. He's very patient. He knows when and how to attack. And it's just not a sprint up and down the floor type of guy and attack that. He can get into the paint and facilitate, but he's going to play at a slower pace than other guys out there. So I think that's one of the misnomers when the Bucks acquired Damian Lillard. And it's one thing to just be aware of look, I get it. You want to get Giannis on the run as much as you can, but that's just not the way that Damian Lillard plays.
Yeah, that's something that's going to have to be talked about. Like, when are the situations that we're looking at to try to push the pace in this situation? Like, it's situational with Dame at this point, because like you mentioned, his comfort zone is taking his time, really being able to kind of probe the defense and see what's available to him. He loves to pick and roll. He likes to take his time, attack the angles. So it's one of those things where it's like, okay, we're going to have to figure out exactly the best ways and situations to push the pace, because Giannis is one of the biggest threats. You said best in the NBA at transition. Like, he's already, in my opinion, just one of the best in NBA history in transition. So it's like, how can we also take advantage of this while also catering to the fact that Dame likes to play at his own pace? And you mentioned how Chris Middleton is also somebody who kind of likes to play with a little bit slower, but yet and still you'll see times where Chris is like, we need to push, like we need to play with more pace at this moment. So I think it's just getting used to it, which is, I saw some fans were upset that Dame wasn't playing against the Hawks because it was due to personal reasons, but I understand saying like, hey, there's only so many games left. We haven't been healthy. I want to see this team get as many reps as they possibly can. But again, you can't ignore that human element that goes into sports and into performance. So with that, like, they're just going to have to figure out as a team the times to push that pace and when they can actually take their time. Because one thing we know about the playoffs as well is everything slows down in the playoffs. So you would think that the style of play that Dame does enjoy playing with will be really beneficial come playoff time.
Yeah. And look, I think it's just the last thing you said is the biggest thing. Is there's a lot that has been going on off the court with Damian Lillard all season long. And I don't think any of us need to pry, and it's not our place to speak on it. And with the amount of games left, Doc Rivers, too, the way he was asked, is there a chance that Dame doesn't finish the road trip, and said, yeah, it's a possibility. I think it's safe to assume you won't have him on Tuesday in Washington, D.C. against the Wizards, and that should be fine, because I saw the same comments and people saying, well, great, now we won't have him for the Wizards either. Guys, if you need Damian Lillard to beat the Wizards when you can see what's on the horizon, and that's a team that's out of the postseason, that's an entirely different conversation. The big thing is just I want Damian Lillard to be Damian Lillard in the playoffs. And if this is part of it, not risking anything and rushing him back, and not that he's coming back from an injury, but who cares? You got some big games left on the schedule. But as we'll talk about a little bit in the next segment too, none of this matters if you take care of business in these next 3 games, because that may well seal where the Bucks are if you can turn this into a 4-game win streak. We'll get into that and a lot of the comments that we continue to see coming up about potential first-round opponents. You know my thoughts and who I would like to avoid, so we'll get into that a little bit more coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, I don't know about the rest of you guys, but it's been a long time since I shifted away from cable entirely to streaming. You do everything on there, streaming devices, on our phones, on our tablets. TV was one of the first things that I moved to. And my first streaming stick was an Amazon Fire TV stick. Fire TV is your destination for sports. You've got live games, highlights that go in depth on analysis. And Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as that Fire TV stick that you can just plug into your existing TV, providing access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. Fire TV recently created the Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels lets you dive into all of the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date on all the latest in the world of sports. March Madness, NBA, MLB, and lots more. Not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, cooking videos, all of that and more. Check out Fire TVs on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit Amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. All right. So Camille, look, I've referenced playoff status quite a bit. And last year they were the first ones in on behind all their algorithms. Bucks are going to end up with a 1 seed. As of this moment, they have the Bucks with a 97% chance to finish no lower than third in the Eastern Conference. Now, I do think part of this boosting, because for a while it was in the mid to high 80s, I do think a part of this was not only seeing that most of those teams around the Bucks have been playing 500. You know, the Bucks have been 6-4 in their last 10 games. Cavs are 4-6. Magic were on a 2-game skid until their win last night. That to me was always the intriguing team because of the fact that they had 2 games left against the Bucks, and that if they could stay within 2 games, knowing they got 2 in their back pocket, that could make things interesting. But now the Bucks are 4 games in front of the Magic. I think we can rule out Orlando jumping up there and catching the Bucks. They're 2 games in front of both the Knicks and the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers remain interesting because they're starting to get healthy. And last night was the first time, or 2 nights ago, Friday night, the first time they had basically their full strength roster in months, in over a month, right? The Knicks, 2 games back of the Bucks. As we mentioned, that's a team that's been playing better. Dante DiVincenzo is all of a sudden an elite 3-point shooter. Yeah. But you do have the tiebreaker over the Knicks. So I just keep coming back to, and I pointed this out last week as well, the stretch the Bucks are in now, starting with that game against the Hawks last night. You won that. Great. Then the Wizards, the Memphis Grizzlies. That is a back-to-back from DC to Milwaukee. And then the Toronto Raptors on Friday night. If you win those 3 games and make this a 4-game win streak, and the importance in those games to me all along was, look, you've got some challenging games left. Mm-hmm. These are games you are going to be expected to win because these are teams that are essentially playing spoiler, right? Nothing else to play for. Hawks they can still get home court in that 9-10 matchup, but that's it. So these are the important ones because if you can take care of business in those games, in games where the Bucks have somewhat struggled, you know, the Hawks, we joked about it being a big win. Those are the teams that have given the Bucks the most fits so far this season. Those teams that are right on the fringe and teams that are missing their best player. Bucks have been basically 500 in those games this season at 14-12, and defense in the bottom 10, offense outside of the top 10. Again, they've been at their best against the best teams in the league, statistically and by way of record. So if you can win these games, the number 51 is what stands out to me, in that if you get to 51 wins, I think that should be good enough for the Bucks to get the 2 seed. So that means you've just got to win 4 more games. Those 3 are big in that sense, because if you win those, I think you go into Sunday night against the New York Knicks knowing, look, even if the Knicks have gone on a win streak and they're still 2 games back, Bucks win that game and they've knocked the Knicks out of potentially catching them.
Yeah, and even if Dame doesn't play against Washington, like we mentioned, that should be a game that this Bucks team can still win from. So when you're looking at the schedule, you mentioned getting the Bucks to 51 wins. The Bucks are currently 47-27, meaning, like you said, just 4 more wins out of their last 8 games. And when you look at the last 8 games of the season for the Bucks, at Washington on Tuesday versus Memphis on Wednesday, so a back-to-back, like you mentioned, Friday versus Toronto at home, Sunday versus the Knicks at home, Tuesday versus the Celtics at home, Wednesday, which so back-to-back against the Magic at home. So 5-game homestand for the Bucks after they do this trip to Washington. Then they end the season on the road in Oklahoma City, in Orlando. And when you look at that schedule, you're like, I can see 4 wins out of this last 8. Like, you, of course, look to Washington, to Memphis, to Toronto. And that Memphis game in particular, that's one where I think the Bucks are going to get up for, because they got embarrassed by those Grizzlies who had the injury report that's longer than the CBS report, a receipt where it's like, we got to get our get back. And the Bucks have been good in these quote unquote revenge games so far this season, where it's like, we owe you one back. And understanding as well, this is a team that's preparing for the playoffs. Pat Bev has mentioned it many times, like, we are gearing up for the playoffs and we understand what our focus needs to be at this time. You do not want to go into the playoffs on a bad note. So I think getting to 51 wins is definitely reasonable to expect from this Bucks team, with who they have left and what they have in front of them, and with the lead that they've been able to build up over the last few weeks, with the Cavaliers having those injuries there, because they were really pressing the Bucks for a moment there. We saw the Knicks jump into that 3 seed at one point over the last week as well. So we don't have any more matchups against the Cavaliers, but we do see the Knicks. So that's like a double whammy type of game. We see the Magic, who's also behind the Knicks. So when it comes to the standings, I do think that that 2 seed area is a place where the Bucks should and could finish. And we've mentioned before, there are positives and negatives with being in that 2 seed, because you aren't aware of who your opponent is going to be until after the play-in games commence. So I think it's all in the Bucks' hands right now. Like, they are in control of their destiny when it comes to what seed they're going to be in. You want to see them finish the season strong, which would pretty much lock up that 2 seed. So that feels very, very reasonable to expect from this team at this point.
So if you go 4-4, which again is not a big ask to say, hey, can you just play 500 going into the playoffs? If you do that, in order for the 2 teams chasing the Bucks, and again, we're going to leave the Magic out of this discussion, given 4 games with 8 games remaining, that is a pretty Herculean lift to make that much of a jump. So those 2 teams chasing the Bucks, if the Bucks go 4-4, the Cavs would need to go 6-2 to pass them, because Cleveland just has to tie the Bucks by way of owning the tiebreaker. The Knicks would need to go 8-1 to pass the Bucks for the 2 seed if you play 500 the rest of the way. And I've seen a few people point out the schedules for those remaining teams. Again, Cleveland has gotten healthy now, but starting today, Easter Sunday, they start a 5-game West Coast road trip.
That's tough.
At Denver today. And Denver, I think, is going to be without Jamal Murray once again, but you're still going to Denver in the altitude and playing against Nikola Jokic. Then you go to Utah, which, again, Bucks fans can vouch. Hey, on paper, easy, not as easy as it seems, playing in Utah against the Jazz. Then you're in Phoenix, and the Suns are in a spot where now all of a sudden the Dallas Mavericks have not only caught them, they have started to pull away from them. So Phoenix still wants to get out of that play-in tournament. That is not going to be an easy game. Then you have 2 games against the Lakers and the Clippers to wrap up that 5-game road trip, where, again, Clippers are trying to hold off the Pelicans for home court in that 4-5 matchup, and the Lakers still have a chance, especially in light of that injury to Malik Monk, to catch the Sacramento Kings or just move up, frankly, and get out of that 9-10 spot where, again, you got one crack at it. You got to win 2 games to get into the postseason. So the travel, the fact that, and Doc Rivers talked about this as well, that it's very strange when you see the schedule in the league these days. For a lot of teams, when you think about the one side of the coast to the other travel for extended periods of time that we're seeing this late into the season, it is unique. I don't recall seeing anything like this in quite some time. And now the Cavaliers are entrenched in it. So they have that 5-game road trip. And then you close out the season with games that you're going to be favored in. You know, home against the Grizzlies, home against the Pacers, home against the Charlotte Hornets. But the big thing is that 5-game road trip. And that's where things could potentially start to go south for the Cavaliers, or at least give the Bucks a little more breathing room. And then, yeah, the Knicks play today as well. So there's some big games to keep an eye on for the Bucks, with the Cavs in Denver against the Nuggets and the Knicks hosting the Oklahoma City Thunder in a big one. They have a schedule kind of similar to the Bucks, where you don't see a ton of challenges. They do have the Celtics left. They do have the Bucks left. They have the Thunder today. Then they're on the road against Miami. Then they have the Kings. But after that, 2 games, 3 games with the Bulls. And again, when you talk about the weird shifts to the schedule, the Knicks play the Bulls 3 times in their final 6 games to the regular season.
Yeah, it's tough. Like, that's all good news for Bucks fans. Like, that is great news for Bucks fans looking at the schedules of those teams that are right below them in the standings that could try to press the Bucks for that 2 seed. So something to keep an eye on. The Bucks are not playing on this Easter Sunday. A special, real quick shout out to everybody who is in the comments watching us as we record this live on Easter Sunday. Appreciate everybody tuning in for that before they get to family festivities or whatever the day might bring. But that's something that Bucks fans should definitely be keeping an eye on, just watching the scoreboard and seeing what's happening with those teams around the Bucks. So keeping an eye on the Cavaliers, keeping an eye on the Knicks, the Magic, and I'm sure they're going to be Bucks fans as well, looking just towards that bottom half of where the play-in tournament sits in the East as well, because there's a lot of conversation as well around this team where it's like, hey, which matchup do we not want the Bucks to have? Like, what's the most unfavorable situation for the Bucks for a first round playoff matchup? So I could also see people paying attention to the Pacers, to the Heat, to the 76ers. And while the Bulls and the Hawks are in the mix, it feels and it feels bad to say it because anything can happen with the playing games since it's a 1-game shot at it. But like, you're not really looking at the Bulls and the Hawks like, okay, this is a team that's really going to look to press somebody.
Well, and the Bucks couldn't get those teams anyway.
Right. Because that's going to be probably the 1 seed to matchup. So like, it's something to look at here. So with that all being said, like, just keep an eye on the standings around them because it is going to help affect the Bucks. The Bucks have to take care of their own business. Like, again, if the Bucks do what they need to do, this shouldn't be a conversation anyways, but just keep an eye on it as the league continues to wind down. And teams are, as we know, this final sprint, everybody is trying to play as hard as they can to get that playoff positioning, to head into the playoffs on a good streak. So we'll have to just keep an eye on it and see how it plays out.
A couple of quick things as we start to wrap up here. It's going to be one of those 3 teams. It's going to be the Pacers, the Heat, or the 76ers is who the Bucks are going to get in the first round. In terms of matchup, who would you most like to face? I think it would be the Pacers, in that I know they won 4 out of 5 against the Bucks. It's a much different team from when they last played. January 3rd was the last time they played the Pacers, I think. The Bucks have a different coach since then. They look different. They've taken advantage of some of that low-hanging fruit and cleaned up a lot of the issues that plagued them in those Pacers games. Not to mention the Pacers no longer have Buddy Hield. Benedict Mathurin is out for the season. Tyrese Halliburton is clearly still impacted by that hamstring issue. It's a much different team. So I think of the 3, that's who you would circle. I'm going to die on this hill in that I think the Bucks should want to play the Miami Heat because of what happened last year. I know we said a lot of the same thing a year ago. It's not the same Miami Heat team as it was last year. I know they've added Jaime Jaquez Jr., who's been very good for them so far this season. It is still a rookie going through his first postseason, regardless of whatever the fairy dust is that the Miami Heat sprinkle on all of their players. It's still a rookie experiencing the postseason for the first time. Some big pieces and their role players are missing from that team. No Max Strus, no Gabe Vincent and what he did to the Bucks in that series. So I do think that's who you should prefer. And you should want to play the Miami Heat because of what happened. And that's the same approach the Bucks took in 2021, where they specifically wanted the Miami Heat because of what happened in the bubble I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't the same message within the locker room again this year. And look, I don't care if it's just me worrying over something that isn't there. Look, I want to see Giannis versus Joel Embiid in the postseason as much as anybody here. We haven't gotten it for years, ever. I don't want it in the first round setting with Joel Embiid just recently returning and with the 76ers going against their former coach and Doc Rivers. I'd rather save that for down the road. So to me, that's still the team I don't want the Bucks to get in the first round is Philly. And I think the attitude should be, we want revenge against the Miami Heat.
Yeah, and I mean that revenge piece, it runs deep. It's like the Miami revenge is like last season, thinking about that, and just the years in the past. Like the Miami Heat and the Bucks have this rivalry that has been developed because of the playoffs. I mean, you go back to the bubble when they got bounced in the bubble. You think of 2021 when the Bucks finally got over that hill. That first game in that series, I won't forget it because it was so close until Chris Middleton hit the shot that really sealed it for the Bucks. And then from that point on in that series, it was really easy rolling for the Bucks thereafter. You think about last year, the 8 seed knocking out the 1 seed and all the public shaming and embarrassment that came on the Bucks from that. Like, you definitely want that get back. So the Miami Heat's a team where it's like, if that's the first round matchup, I'm here for it. I'm not shying away from it. Want to see how that plays off. But if that first round matchup also ends up being the Pacers, it's not as deep as that Miami feeling because of the years of playing against the Heat and what has happened there. But this season in itself, with everything that happened with the Bucks and with the Pacers, from the game ball gate, just to the Tyrese Halliburton tapping his wrist in the in-season tournament afterwards, and just the trash talking in the fields around this team, would also be a really fun first round matchup for the team. And as you mentioned, these teams are completely different from when they last saw each other. And the Pacers are also dealing with some injuries as well. But either one of those two, that's the first round matchup that I personally want. And it's more so for not just the narrative, but just for the Bucks to kind of get over that mental hump against those two teams, because the Pacers won the regular season matchup against the Bucks. The Pacers don't have a fear of the Bucks, and the Heat already mentioned the long history that goes between those two teams. The 76ers, to your point about Embiid and Giannis seeing each other in the playoffs, like, I want it. It's just that in comparison to these other two matchups, like, I want to see those a little bit more than that 76ers one.
Somebody asked me yesterday, I was talking the same conversation and said, like, why are you so afraid of the 76ers? Embiid is not going to be the guy that he was in the beginning of the season. And I recognize that. Like, I don't think we can expect Joel Embiid to be what he was before January, 29th, 30th, when he suffered, when he went down for the surgery there. So I get that, but I think we're also discounting, just because of how much we love Giannis, how incredible Joel Embiid was offensively to start the season. And even if he's 80% of that, that's going to be a challenge. And it's going to come down to Brook Lopez having to stay out of foul trouble, because that's it. Those are your three bigs now. You don't have Robin anymore to throw out there for fouls. That's going to be crucial. Tyrese Maxey has exploded and come into his own, and that would be a matchup to circle of Maxey versus Damian Lillard, and who wins this battle. And, oh, by the way, the elephant in the room, I understand he doesn't have the same personnel in Philly. Nick Nurse, outside of Eric Spoelstra, that's the guy that has diagrammed the defenses to slow down Giannis the most. So those are the things I would point to and say, I don't know if that's what I'd want in the first round if I'm a Bucks fan. One last thing to leave you with, because a few people asked about this as well when we talked about Bucks have not played too well against those mid-tier teams. But hey, they've been very good against the best. Still have the third best win percentage in the league in games played against the top 10 teams in the league by way of net rating. Do the Bucks. They are second in net rating in those games against the 10 best teams, trailing only the Oklahoma City Thunder, and they're third in offense, seventh in defense. I mentioned against those mid-tier teams, it's outside of the top 10 offensively, in the bottom 10 defensively. So again, just as we've pointed to for, hey, when you got Giannis and Dame and Chris on the floor, their numbers are really good. When they play the best teams, they have been one of the best teams in the league. So that's, I think, what you would highlight, circle, whatever you need to do, and say, this is why I feel good going into the postseason. Yep. We will be
really quick to that point. I just want to highlight one comment to end everything, because I think it sums up what you just said. And it comes from Jonathan in the comments, who just said, don't care who we get, bring the smoke. Like, that's the energy. Like, when you're looking at the Bucks against the top teams, like, that's how they looks like based on how you've seen the stats play out and how they get up for those games. Like that's what it seems like. So heading to the playoff, Jonathan, I'm with you. Bring the smoke.
And that was the attitude in 2021. Again,
Mhm.
the behind closed doors meeting that we eventually learned about after the Heat series of the message was we don't care who we face, but it was we want the Miami Heat. So that's who we hope we get in the first round. And we saw what happened there. We'll be back once again on Tuesday with another show recapping Monday Night Raw as we head into WrestleMania, getting set for the game against the Washington Wizards. Again, don't laugh, but a big stretch of games here for the Bucks for the reasons we just laid out. You win these games, you're going to be the 2 seed. But again, you got to win those games first. So we will be back Tuesday to preview that matchup, take a look at anything else. Maybe we can get a little bit more into the Giannis MVP discussion. We did it a week or so ago. We said, hey, he's making some traction. I think Luka Doncic has now moved past Giannis. So we can get into that conversation as well. We'll also, as we know what the postseason is going to look like a little more, we can get into some more awards discussion, specifically Bobby Portis and his chances, and take a clearer look at the rest of the Eastern Conference. And yes, I'm going to point it out again. Camille, I'm sure you've been bombarded with the questions. We are still working on getting the former host of this show to make an appearance. He has become a megastar now, so there's just a lot more steps that we have to go through. But we are working on it. I know we've said it quite a bit. It's just like Doc Rivers when he talked about Chris Middleton's return. He's close. I know I said it a lot, but he's close. We're working on it. I think it's close, but we've said it a lot. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again Tuesday with more Locked On Bucks.